this session will be recorded so that you know that ahead of time. So thank you so much for joining us today. I understand many of you may have had a very long day online, so it's awesome that you could join us tonight as well. We want to let you know that this session is going to be a little bit different from sessions in the past, because we are definitely going to talk about the probability, expectations, curriculum connections, resources, all of those things. However, we want to start off by having some discussions around equity in mathematics. So Rhonda and I, as well as the other consultants, we've been doing a lot of learning lately about looking at equity in mathematics. So we want to sort of reframe some of our conversations about math using that context. And we've just sort of begun our work in this, and so it's really hard work. There's not a lot of resources that are out there, so we're just going to sort of dip our toes in tonight and start talking about that, because we do think that we have a moral imperative to look at how to incorporate making sure that we are ensuring equity in our math classrooms. So we're also fairly committed to trying to build a bank of resources that teachers can use with that equity lens in mind, since there isn't a lot of resources that are currently out there. And understand as well that all of these conversations that we're having about equity are also in the context of the efforts for de-streaming. So right now, de-streaming taking place in grade 9 math. Except what we are learning, of course, is that streaming happens all the way along, so that we all have to take a responsibility for what we need to do in those efforts towards de-streaming as well. So with all of that being said, let's get into it. So this is the teaching and learning support staff looking at mathematics. So we have our primary and our junior people, and of course our intermediate people, myself, Lene Bates, and Rhonda Hewer is with us tonight as well. So she will pipe in whenever she would like, I hope. Okay, so first, we always want to look at where we might be in terms of the long-range plans. So at this point, many of you may be looking at the spatial sense topic. This is the grade 7 long-range plan, circles and cylinders. We, of course, tonight are talking about data probability. The data probability unit is only about 10 plus days. So before you know it, we'll also be getting into our next topic of financial literacy. There's a whole bunch of equity topics to talk about in financial literacy, so that's part of the reason as well why we're starting to talk about some of those things tonight. So today's agenda, first we're going to look at any prerequisite knowledge that students need. Then we'll walk into some connections. For tonight, it's going to be with some equity connections. We'll look at curriculum expectations, and of course, we'll look at some resources as well. So when we look at the grade 7 and grade 8 specific expectations around data probability, you'll notice, as we've done in some cases in the past, so the blue box that goes around all of the B expectations, those are number expectations that you are revisiting. So you'll notice in both grade 7 and 8, those number expectations mostly have to do with the students being able to work flexibly between fractions, decimals, ratios, and percents. They've been working with those concepts in a few units this year, so you'll want to maybe talk about some of those ideas in your number talks, etc. Then when we look at the data probability, or sorry, the data expectation or probability expectations, in both grades, it definitely highlights that students need to know the difference between independent and dependent events. We'll talk about that this evening. They need to know the difference between theoretical and experimental probabilities. And they also need to find the answer to probability problems using a variety of models. So we'll look at a variety of models this evening as well. So the prerequisite knowledge. So given the new curriculum this year, for grade 8s, there's really no new prerequisite concerns that we have for grade 8 students. For grade 7 students, on the other hand, there is a bit of prerequisite knowledge needed. So in the 2020 grade 6 curriculum, students are looking at the theoretical and experimental probability of 2 independent events. However, your students in grade 7 this year, having the old grade 6 curriculum last year they were only expected to look at the theoretical probability of only 1 event. So looking at 2 events will be new for them. Also, in the new grade 6 curriculum, they are to know how to express probability with fractions, decimals, or percents. But those students who were in grade 6 last year were only expected to express probability as a fraction or a ratio. So it's just something for grade 7 teachers to keep in mind, that students may not have examined 2 events before, and they may not have expressed probability in terms of a decimal or a percent. So that's sort of the prerequisite knowledge that we want to consider before we start topics like this. And now we'll move into some other connections we want to look at. And as I said tonight, we're going to be specifically looking at some connections with equity in mathematics. So I want to have a look at this first. This is from Rochelle Gutierrez. She wrote a book called Rehumanizing Mathematics for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx Students in 2018. And it was brought to my awareness in listening to a presentation that Octavia Beckles did. She's a consultant in the York Region District School Board. I highly recommend, if you ever get a chance to listen to Octavia Beckles speak, it's well worth it. So actually, what we're going to ask you to do is, I'm not going to read these 4 statements for you. I'm going to give you a chance to have a look at the 4 statements that are there. I believe Rhonda in the chat is going to provide a link to a separate slide deck. The first slide on that slide deck is this slide exactly. And you'll notice that in the bottom, there's 3 different types of icons. So the green smiley face, for any of the ideas listed there that really resonate with your thinking already. There's the yellow lightning bolt at the bottom there that you can grab one of those. If anything on this page is really new learning for you, but you really like it, it's a new piece of learning that you're going to do some thinking about. And then a third icon at the bottom there for questions. So anything that you're reading there that's interesting, but you still have some questions about, we'd like you to drag those anywhere onto that document so that we can sort of see where your thinking is in terms of rehumanizing mathematics. And after you've had a chance to do that, we might talk about some of the areas that you have questions about. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes to do that. Feel free as well to use multiple icons if it's appropriate. Okay, I'll give you about 30 more seconds and then we'll sort of see where people are landing. Okay, so feel free to keep placing icons if you're not quite done yet. Totally fine. It's interesting when you look at the slide here because we've got icons that are either resonating, new learning, or questions on just about all of them, which makes sense because looking at sort of equity in mathematics and rehumanizing mathematics is new for almost everybody. So we're all in different places on this chart. So sort of what I see is there's parts that resonate with almost everybody. Most of the questions have to do with either the second or the fourth bullet there. So the second one, we know that we have a moral imperative to change the game of mathematics. So explore and address biases, inequities, and use inclusive practices. I'm guessing part of the questions there is because that is sort of ambiguous, right? Trying to figure out what the inequities are in mathematics and where our biases are. But if there's anybody that wants to put something in the chat that is more specific about questions they had about that one, we can discuss that more if you'd like. So if anybody wants to put anything in the chat or even unmute, that's fine as well. Okay, and we are going to be talking about some of these things more throughout this session as well, so things might become more clear there. And then there's a question with the bottom one there too. Every student should be provided with windows and mirrors into the world through mathematics. They should see aspects of themselves reflected back, which is the mirror part, as well as obtain views of their own world and new worlds outside of their own. So that's the window part. And I found that particular statement really impactful in my thinking around math lately. It's a new concept for me, the whole idea of providing windows and mirrors. But shockingly enough, this sort of idea of windows and mirrors in math and other subjects has been around since 1996. Was popularized by Emily Stiles. So we're going to talk quite a bit about that one with our next activity. Feel free as well, if you have more questions, that you can drop those in the chat as they come along. Okay. So now what I'd like to do is start a 3-act math task. With some of these ideas in mind about trying to rehumanize math for our students. So I'd like to start with an Act 1. And what I would like to do is just sort of read through the information with you on this slide. And as you're reading or listening, I'd like you to be thinking about anything you notice about this information that is being shared with you, or anything that you wonder. And then at the end of going through this slide, if you can put your noticings or your wonderings in the chat, we'd like to discuss some of those obviously before moving on to Act 2. So Act 1, this is about sickle cell disease, where we're going to look at some data and statistics on sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease affects millions of people throughout the world. and is particularly common among those whose ancestors come from sub-Saharan Africa, Spanish-speaking regions in the Western Hemisphere, so South America, the Caribbean, and Central America, Saudi Arabia, India, and Mediterranean countries such as Turkey, Greece, and Italy. People of African descent are most likely to carry the gene. So 1 in 12 people of African descent carry the sickle cell gene. Sickle cell disease is a condition in which red blood cells are not shaped as they should be. Red blood cells look like round discs, but in sickle cell disease, they're shaped like sickles or crescent moons instead, as the picture below. These sickle-shaped cells get stuck together and can block small blood vessels. This stops blood from moving as it should, which can lead to pain and organ damage. So I'm going to give you a minute to think about the information on that slide there. There's no right or wrong answers here. Anything that you notice in looking at this information or anything that you're wondering about when you look at this information. If you can enter those ideas into the chat, that would be helpful. I can't say it fast very many times, I'll tell you that, Rhonda. Is this a dominant or recessive gene? Yeah. So any noticings or wonderings at all could be about genetics, could be about the regions identified, anything. Is there a treatment? Great question, Byron. This reminds me of windows and mirrors into the world. Some students might not know about this. Exactly, Tyrone. Yeah, there will be students in your classroom that know a lot about this because it affects them and their family, and students that know nothing about it. So from Wendy, so if a parent has sickle cell disease, not just a carrier, are you more likely to get the disease than if a parent is just a carrier? Exactly. Just maybe give another 30 seconds there if anybody else wants to enter a noticing or a wondering. Okay, so we'll move on. And Rhonda, if there is any other chats, then anything in the chat, then just let me know. So as a teacher, if you're listening to your students noticing and wonderings, then obviously that provides you with a great deal of information in terms of what might be a mirror or a window for students in your class. So when they do have those noticings and wonderings, some of the comments made by your students might allow you to realize that some of the information here mirrors things about themselves or their family. And then other questions let you know sort of what they know about the world around them. So it can be a very powerful exercise. Okay, so Act 2. So some of your noticings and wonderings are bang on in terms of the problem that we're about to look at. So with sickle cell, you can have the sickle cell trait, so the abbreviation up top, SCT, or you can have sickle cell disease, SCD. So people can inherit either. So sickle cell disease is passed down genetically, or they can have passed down genetically the sickle cell trait. So making them a potential carrier, but with no disease or symptoms. So the problem that we're going to look at together is I want to know the probability that a child might inherit the trait or the disease. So another question for you to think about and enter your thinking into the chat. What are some pieces of information that would be useful for you to have in order to be able to answer that question? So if I want to know the probability that a child might inherit the trait or the disease, what are some pieces of information you would have to have in order to be able to answer that question? So once again, we'll just ask you to put any of your thinking in the chat. What do you need to know? Okay, so we have the frequency of SCT or SCD in a population, whether it's a dominant trait or not. Those would both be very helpful pieces of information. Anything else anybody can think of that you would need to know in order to be able to determine the probability? If both parents have either, exactly. Anything else you think you would need to know or would be helpful to know? Okay, you've hit the major points there for sure. So the things that you would need to know. So in the table below here, it gives you some information you would need to know in order to be able to solve any probability problem about this. So sickle cell genetics. A child inherits one allele from one biological parent and one allele from the other biological parent. So the affected hemoglobin alleles are when a child gets the HbA allele from one parent, that is a normal allele. So that is not a sickle cell trait or disease allele. If a child gets an HbS allele from a parent, then that is the sickle cell trait. So if you look at the table below there, allele 1 and allele 2. So the first scenario, if a child gets an HbA from one parent and an HbA from another parent, they will have no sickle cell trait and obviously no sickle cell disease. If a child gets an HbA from one parent and an HbS from another parent, then they will inherit the sickle cell trait, but no disease. Third scenario, if a child gets the HbS from one parent and the HbS from the other parent, they will end up with sickle cell disease. So now what we would like to do is look at a problem based on this sickle cell probability. So you can go back to the same slide deck as before, or if you have X'd out of that one, I know Rhonda's going to put that same link in the chat again. So we're looking at the second slide there. That is presenting the problem. I'll just wait till everybody's had a chance to get there. Okay, so on that slide, here is the problem that we're going to look at. So sickle cell probability. What is the probability that a child might inherit the sickle cell trait or the sickle cell disease from their biological parents? So in a moment, we're going to ask you, you're going to go into breakout groups, and with your group, you're going to show your thinking using any model you would like to try to solve this probability problem. So you might use a table, you might use an area model, you might use a tree diagram, a Venn diagram, any model you would like to try to solve the problem. So on the subsequent slides, so after this second slide, you'll see copies of the same slide so that one group will use a slide where I want you to try to only solve 2 of the 3 genetic scenarios. So there's 3 genetic scenarios presented on the slides. You only need to, with your group, try to solve 2 of them. And you can feel free to try out different models for each scenario if you like. So the table is still there, showing you the different alleles and what it means. Rhonda, I believe, is currently working on putting you in breakout groups. And if you want to try to establish some roles within your group, it's always a good idea if we sort of model this, so you could do this with your students as well. That I'm not sure how many people are going to be in a group at this point, but if you want to sort of look at birthdays from January to December, and you could establish roles like whoever has the earliest birthday in the year sort of reviews the problem for the group, sort of what you're trying to solve. The second next earliest birthday could choose which scenario you want your group to tackle first, and maybe what model you might use. Third next earliest birthday, choose the second scenario you maybe want to look at and what model you're going to do. And a fourth person could look at accuracy. So what we're going to ask you to do is take the next 5 minutes with your group, use any model you would like. On those slides, I'll just go to what one of them looks like. All of those things can be dragged around. So you can make copies of the little people, you can make copies of the alleles, you can drag them around any way you would like. So you're just trying to solve that problem. What is the probability that a child with those 2 biological parents would inherit either the trait or the disease? So Rhonda, are we ready to send people to breakout groups for about 5 minutes?
Yes, we are. The breakout room is open.
Okay, awesome.
How many minutes did you say, Lene? I wasn't paying attention.
I said about 5.
Okay, were you timing that? I wasn't timing either.
Not, I can start one.
Okay.
I'll start from 4 for now.
Yeah, because I think have a minute warning when the breakout rooms are going to close.
Rhonda, are you there?
Right here.
My timer says we've only got about 45 more seconds, so I don't know if we cut it off or do we want to give that group more of a chance to try another model?
It's 4:34.
Yeah, we probably do need to cut them off. Eh?
Yeah, they probably got the learning, like they probably got enough of the learning from this one, from the looks of it.
Okay, good.
Do you want me to close them?
Sure. Okay, is everybody back then?
Nope, they're ignoring it. They're all still in the breakout room.
Oh, okay. I was like, I don't know how to tell when they're back.
Here they come.
Okay,
That means it was a good conversation. They didn't want to leave it.
that's good.
It's a sign of an engaging task.
Okay, I'm just gonna get rid of the grid view here, if it'll let me.
You only have one back. The other four are still, we are deep into it. They may be late, Tyrone says.
Okay, they're okay. Sure.
I think they moved on to a second one, maybe.
Okay. Oh yes, I'm seeing the message in the chat now. We were deep into it. Okay.
I can hear Chad laughing, so.
I like their use of the arrows and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Oh, now they've all come back.
Okay. 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 So I'm really glad to hear that you were engaged in that task. So there was only one slide that we needed to look at. So we can see from your work here that some people would describe this as a table or an area model. So it's awesome. You came up with a model that you wanted to use. And then obviously it does take a while to look through these different scenarios. So we're going to have a look at what the results can show you, obviously. So if people did get a chance to look at the 3 different results, depending on the models that you're using, and obviously we love the fact that you are using those visual models to show. So this is really just checking the results. So whenever you would be doing an Act 3, that you would sort of consolidate the results there. So scenario number 1 parent without any sickle cell alleles and 1 parent with the trait, then you would have found that the children would have a 50% probability of inheriting the trait, and then a 50% probability of inheriting no trait, no disease. In the second scenario, if you had both biological parents being carriers of the trait only, then there was a 50% chance that the child could inherit the trait. There is a 25% chance or a 1/4 chance that the child could inherit the disease, and a 25% chance that a child would inherit no trait or disease. And then in the third scenario, where we have one parent who has the sickle cell disease and one person with the sickle cell trait, then there is a 50% chance that any child would inherit the sickle cell trait, and as well a 50% chance that any child would inherit the sickle cell disease. So just sort of a visual way of representing the results here. And obviously you can see the opportunity here as well for discussing student answers, looking at expressing probability as a decimal fraction percent, listening to students' answers and, saying, okay, so this group says it's a 1/4 probability, this group says 25%. Is that the same answer? So, what we were looking at in terms of our equity lens was with questions like this that present a possibility for windows and mirrors, is maybe there's an Act 4 or an encore that's necessary when we're looking at problems in this way. So we would want to talk to students about, why does this matter? So we can talk about, after a problem like this, when they've looked at the math, so there's global implications, right? So the prevalence of the sickle cell trait varies in a variety of regions, and it reaches as high as 40% in some of those areas mentioned there, sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Saudi Arabia, and Central India. That by 2050, the World Health Organization is saying that the number of people with sickle cell disease is expected to increase by about 30% globally. That 90% plus of children with sickle cell disease do not survive to adulthood if they are born into resource-poor countries. That approximately 1,000 children are born with sickle cell disease in Africa every single day, and more than half will die before their 5th birthday. Then, of course, we can look at the North American implications of this. So if 1 in 12 people of African descent have the sickle cell trait, and then, of course, some have the sickle cell disease, you might want to talk to your students about what those implications would be. So especially in the United States, some families have difficulty with access to healthcare and the implications that that could hold. Another example of an implication you might talk about is there have been sort of recent articles with the treatment of people of different races during the pandemic, that there is this notion out there that Black patients don't feel pain the same way that patients of other races do. So there's an article there that you could look at with students as well, knowing that some of the symptoms of sickle cell disease can involve a great deal of pain. So we won't go into it right now just because we're sort of tight for time, but you could think about what might be some other implications that you could discuss about how the math, how math can help them understand these ideas that may affect some of them personally, and then ways of seeing the world as well. So, other connections. So we definitely have an equity focus more in our new curriculum. So this slide, we'll just leave it as a reference slide. So when the slide deck becomes available on the long range plan site and the just in time site, you can have a look through here, but the new curriculum does explicitly mention equity connections in terms of providing students with that high quality mathematics, having high expectations for each and every one of our students, and then making sure that the learning opportunities are, for lack of a better term, windows and mirrors for our students. Also, you can always have these prompting questions for yourself with an equity lens. So again, this is just a reference slide. You can look at in more detail later, but these are questions that you can ask yourself in your math class. So who is learning in my math class and who is not, and why? So we always want to be looking at our own practices, right? Checking sort of that equity lens. Am I using problem contexts that are familiar to my students? Also other things like, do I look only for answers or solutions that I know, that I recognize and I appreciate, or am I looking for other ways of tackling problems as well? So we've looked at the prerequisite knowledge. We've looked at connections to equity. We're going to look at some of the curriculum expectations now. So again, when we look at those curriculum expectations, we have our grade 7 and our grade 8. When we look at the probability expectations in particular, we want to be highlighting for students that they need to understand the difference between independent and dependent events. They need to understand the difference between theoretical and experimental probabilities. And we want to have them use a variety of tools and strategies for solving problems using a variety of models. So we're going to have a look at this problem, which sort of highlights student understanding between independent versus dependent events. So I'm going to present this problem to you. So Sean was trying not to wake his young brother early one morning when he was getting ready to meet his friends for a 3-on-3 basketball game. He was hopeful he could pull out a matching pair of blue socks from his drawer in their shared room without turning on the light. He only had 4 clean socks left in the drawer. 2 were blue, 2 were green. His friends joked that he failed at his 4 out of 16 or 1 out of 4 chance of pulling out a matching pair of blue socks. Do you agree with his friend's probability for pulling out the 2 blue socks? So have a look at that problem for a second and see if you agree with their assessment that he had a 4 out of 16 chance or a 1 out of 4 chance of pulling a pair of blue socks. And then if you want to just put in the chat if you agree with their assessment or not. So are they correct? Did he have a 4 out of 16 or a 1 out of 4 chance of pulling a matching pair of blue socks? Okay, so Wendy's saying you find the question confusing. He did have a 1 in 4 chance of pulling a pair of blue socks. Tyrone says he doesn't agree. I love this. I love it when students and teachers don't agree. Does anybody else got an opinion? What do you think? Grace says she also does not agree. Anybody else have an opinion? Okay, so let's look at whether his friends were correct or not. So this problem highlights the difference between 2 independent events and 2 dependent events. So the question was, do you agree? And the answer is, I don't think so. This is an example of dependent events. So when you're debriefing about a problem like this, first of all, the model that's being used here is a tree diagram. So the letters on the left-hand side are the 4 socks that were in the drawer to begin with. So 2 blue socks, 2 green socks. His friends, of course, were then saying that they figured he would still have a choice between the 4 socks when he pulled out the second one, but that's not in fact true. So this is actually some words from Marion Small. So she talk with students about why there are only 12 possible outcomes and not 16. So once the first blue sock is chosen and not returned to the drawer, there are only 3 possible socks to choose from the second time. You'll see in the tree diagram, the second groupings there's only 3 possibilities each time. So talk about how the first result influenced the probabilities of the second one. So for example, if a blue sock is chosen the first time, the probability of picking a blue sock the second time is only 1/3, since there are only 3 socks left in the drawer and only 1 of them is blue. So you want to tell the students when the probability of the second event is influenced by the results of the first event, the events are called dependent. But if the first sock had been returned to the drawer after pulling it out the first time, the two events would be independent because you would have the same number of outcomes the second time. So instead of there being 16 outcomes, there were only 12. And the correct answer is, of course, that he had a 2 out of 12 possible outcomes, 2 out of 12 chance of pulling a pair of blue socks, or of course, we could express that as 1/6. So that problem highlights the difference between independent events or dependent events. So the next concept that we want to highlight in probability is for students to understand the difference between experimental versus theoretical probability. So the grade 7 and grade 8 WRDSB long-range plans provide many suggestions for experiments that can be conducted to test theoretical probability against experimental probability using tools like cubes, die, and spinners. In this environment as well, in the online environment, you could always have sort of a table, a chart, a spreadsheet where you could combine data from groups of students or pairs of students to demonstrate that the experimental probability is much more likely to be close to the theoretical probability when you have a lot of data. So when students are performing their experiments, they want to be able to perform it many times, and that data will become closer to the actual theoretical probability. Also, there are tools online like virtual spinners where you could even take sort of the sickle cell problem or another relevant problem and make sure that on the spinner you can adjust the number of possible outcomes, even assign a particular color to an allele, say in this case. So there's lots of ways that you can show the difference between experimental and theoretical probability, and how the more events that you do, the closer you get to that theoretical probability. So next in the curriculum, so we talked about independent versus dependent events. We talked about theoretical versus experimental. We also want to provide students with the opportunity to look at lots of different models. So in the grade 7 curriculum, they have to be able to determine and compare the theoretical and experimental probabilities of 2 independent events. They also have to do it with 2 dependent events. So this particular video here, we're not going to show it now, but you can have access to it with the slide deck. But it's a great example of how you could use an area model with students in order to figure out the probability of 2 independent events. So in this sample, the teacher actually uses different color Starburst candy. So if you're doing this with students who are learning online right now like they are, you could ask students sort of the night before to collect some items. So they could do it with colored candy. They obviously, as well, not everybody has candy at home. Simply have 2 cups with little pieces of paper with certain colored dots on them. And then when you watch the video, you can see how you can make an area model. The students can make their own area model at home as well, so that they have that sort of concrete example going to the concrete being the candy, the representative being the area model, so that they can sort of start to see the abstract. Didn't mean to do that, sorry. So the next model that you want to maybe look at, so in the grade 8 curriculum, they need to solve various problems that involve probability using appropriate tools and strategies, and they specifically mention Venn and tree diagrams. Also in the grade 8 curriculum, they have to be able to calculate the theoretical and experimental probability of multiple independent events. So again, this particular video is kind of cool because they show how you can combine clothes to come up with a certain number of outfits. So you can see even from the tree diagram that's there, if a student has 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 3 pairs of shoes, how many different options for outfits that they have. And then of course they choose the favorite one at the end. So again, another opportunity for sort of a concrete example. Again, students could gather some of these items at home, and then come up with sort of the abstract from the representation of the tree diagram. So that's just another example of making it visual for your students. So we talked about the prerequisite knowledge students need to have. We talked about connections with equity, curriculum expectations, and we just want to highlight a couple of resources. So this is again a reference slide. This is from Leaps and Bounds from Marion Small. Just highlight some of the things that your students might struggle with probability. So we've already talked about some of them, sort of the difference between independent, dependent, the difference between theoretical, experimental. There's other things like if they are creating spinners of their own, that they have to make sure that each outcome is equally likely. So there's a couple of things there that are common misunderstandings for students. As always as well, the lovely Michelle Lang has made a sample week at a glance for you. So on these sample weeks at a glance, there are the learning goals and observational look-fors in each lesson. I will go on the link here in just a sec. There's always the parts about building fluency, solving through problems, and of course the purposeful practice. It always includes content from Math Up, and it suggests follow-up lessons as well. If I just go here for a second. Again, you'll notice obviously that when you look at the building of fluency section, we don't have sort of one of those every day. That's not necessarily reasonable that you would be having a math talk every day. So you see there's talks there for 3 out of 5. You'll also notice that on the days that some days have the minds on the action, the consolidation, whereas other days focus more just on the purposeful practice. Also at the bottom of that document, I'm just going to make this a bit smaller. There is a resource there called Math That Matters by Dave Stocker, and that has some problems in it that have those sort of more real world connections that have a social justice slant as well. So you might want to check some of those out. Okay. So a strategy harvest. So some of the strategies that we use today, we always use that sort of visual cues with color coding. We used the shared Google slide as vertical non-permanent surfaces so that students can see each other's thoughts. We established some group roles for collaboration with random groupings. We looked at a 3-act open math task. We had the interactive slide so we could find out sort of your thinking on some of those equity pieces at the beginning. We used the strategy of notice and wonder so that you could find out about some of those places that your students might be at. And then of course we tried to look at some culturally relevant math tasks to really enforce that idea of windows and mirrors. So for next time, we actually have some information about 2 PD opportunities. So your probability unit, as we mentioned, is only about 10 plus days. So already again on Tuesday, May the 18th, we have our next session. This one is to look at the financial literacy piece. And that one is fairly complex just because it's new for everybody and there are a lot of equity issues that we need to look at within those expectations. Also along that equity line, there's also a session on Thursday, May the 13th from 4 to 5 that's all about de-streaming math in grade 9. It is an information session for elementary teachers. So as intermediate math teachers, we're all interested, of course, in in what this looks like, the de-streaming in grade 9. So some of our secondary consultants are going to be facilitating that particular event. So we encourage any of you to go to that session as well, just to learn some more about the why, the what, the how of de-streaming math in grade 9. So that's really it for this evening. If anybody has any questions or concerns, feel free to stick around. We'd be happy to answer any questions for anybody, or just chat about anything that's going on in your math classrooms.